All right, Joe, we'll say good morning. Let us begin. Thank our sponsors for the shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, the Elbaum family for dedicating all of the shir and drashos this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of their loving husband and father, Jerry Yaakov Koppel ben Avram Menachem. To thank Mrs. Bracha Strimber for dedicating all the shir and drashos this month in memory of Avi Strimber, Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Gail and Doug Stenger, in honor of their grandson, ETL Mordechai Weinberg, who in Meretz Hashem became a bar mitzvah yesterday, will in Meretz Hashem continue his simcha this coming Shabbos. We thank Moshe and Dvorah Werdersheim for dedicating all the shurim, for dedicating all the learning this week in this chus of refuah shlema for Yara Galit Bas Shai Etel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she together with Kol Cholei Yisrael will have a complete and enduring refuah, and all the neshamas should have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And also with that, let us begin. I want to give a special thank you to Reb Kalman Akiva for delivering the shir this week and doing such a beautiful and masterful job. Yeshakayach, thank you very much. Moshe, with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful daf. I had a fascinating Gemara with a ton of halacha l'mais of sugyas. Try to get to as many as we can over the course of the shir. But we are picking up, in today's daf is Ayin Vav 76, and we are picking up on Ayin Hamad Beis 75b at the Mishnah. Shabbos say this is really quite a fascinating Gemara, or fascinating Mishnah. Naga b'char so shaltana. So we'll say, okay, so remember, we're talking about roasting the carbon Pesach. So imagine for a moment you're roasting the carbon Pesach in a tanur, in an oven. Now, let's understand over here, roasting the carbon Pesach in a tanur by itself is not necessarily problematic, as long as, in other words, you could roast the Pesach in a oven, but it has to be roasted over a fire. Remember again, as opposed to roasting, which is sometimes performed with the fire on top and let's say the meat on the bottom. So Karban Pesach could be roasted in what's called the tanur, as long as halacha l'maisa again, the animal itself is not touching the sides of the tanur. It could be suspended in the tanur with an active live fire on the bottom of the tanur. Fine. So now says the Mishnah, so what happens if over the course of the roasting, the Karban Pesach itself touches the side of the oven? So it touches the side of the oven. So the meat itself comes in kind of the side of the oven. What's the halacha? Yiklof es makomo. You will say now, yiklof literally means you have to peel away. You have to peel away the layer of flesh that came in contact with the tanur. We'll say, what's the problem with it coming in contact with the tanur? So remember again, Karban Pesach has to be tzli eish. Has to be tzli eish, which means it has to be roasted by fire. The moment that it comes in contact with the tanur means that piece of meat became cooked through contact with hot metal. So it doesn't disqualify the carbon in its entirety, but what it does do is disqualify the piece of meat, the piece of the carbon, which came in contact with the hot metal surface. So yiklof means you just have kolof, you have peel off. You peel off the outer layer that came in contact with the oven, and the rest is good to go. Both listen to this case. Notaf meirotvo alacheres v'chazer elav. Listen to this case. Let's say some gravy dripped off from the Karban Pesach, fell onto the oven, and then splashed back onto the Karban Pesach. So notaf meirotvo alacheres v'chazer elav. So the gravy dripped off the carbon onto the oven, splashed back from the oven onto the carbon. Yitales makomo. Then you have to remove that area of meat where the gravy splashed back on. Now, both say, let's just identify our terms. We're now introduced to two different ideas. There's yiklof es makomo and yitol es makomo. Yiklof es makomo just means the removal of a very thin outer layer. Yitol es makomo means you have to take a bit more meat. What's the difference between the two cases? In case number one, the meat came in contact with the surface of the oven. We assume, therefore, again, it's only the outer layer that really is impacted by that connection. Masha'in came gravy, liquid, gets absorbed back into the Karban Pesach. Therefore, halacha l'mais, it's not just enough to remove a little bit of an outer layer, but you have to remove a bit more meat wherever the gravy could have gotten absorbed into it. So we'll say, so again, so case number one, the Pesach comes in contact with the surface of the oven. Case number two, the gravy drips off onto the oven, splashes back, and is absorbed into the Karban Pesach. Good. Notaf meirotva ala soles. We'll say, what happens if halacha l'maisa, some of the gravy drips off onto solids. Let's say you have some flour that's accumulated. What's the halacha? Yikmots as makomo. So ultimately, again, in that case, halacha lamaisa, you have to go ahead. Now, yikmots, we're also familiar with that word, kmitza. Remember, whenever you're dealing with gravy, so we assume that gravy gets absorbed not just on the thin layer of the surface, but gravy gets absorbed a little bit more inside of the item in which it is being absorbed. So if it gets absorbed into flour, you have to take a little bit of a handful of flour out. Sachu b'shem shel truma. Sachu b'shem truma. What happens if you basted your Karban Pesach in oil of truma? You smeared it in truma oil. Now remember, that's not necessarily a problem. In chaburas kohanim yochelu. All right, if your chabura is a chabura of kohanim, no problem. Let them enjoy. In shal Yisrael, however, what happens if your chabura is a chabura of Yisraelim? So both say, so now remember, a Yisrael can't eat shemen shal truma, can't eat truma oil. So what do? So it depends. Im chayhu yadichenu. If you discovered what you did and the animal is still raw, no problem. Just wash off the animal. Just wash it off. Because remember, everything is cold. The animal is raw. Just wash it off. The shemen shel truma goes away. Im tzlihu, but however, halacha lamaisa, if you already roasted it, yiklof esachitzon. All you need to do is to remove a very thin outer peel. Right? Remove the thin outer layer of the Karban Pesach, and halacha lamaisa, now you're talking about, I know what you're thinking. Why is this different than the gravy case? Again, we'll see in the Gemara. Sachu b'shem shel ma'aser sheni. What happens if you basted the Pesach in oil of Ma'aser Sheni? So we'll say, so remember again, that by itself is not problematic either, because you remember, where are you eating Karban Pesach? We're eating Karban Pesach in Yerushalayim, so not a problem. However, lo ya'asenu damim al b'nei chabura shein podin Ma'aser Sheni b'Yerushalayim. So let's listen to this. Now, normally, remember again, when you had Karban Pesach, so b'pashtos, okay, if it was your family, that's one thing, but if you're joining with a whole bunch of people, what would happen? You would go ahead and you would split the cost of the Karban Pesach amongst the participants. So let's say there's 10 of us. Let's say the animal costs, whatever it is, $100. So okay, $10 a person. But let's say halacha l'maisa. Now I took charge of the chabura, so I smeared the animal with my oil of Ma'aser Sheni. With my oil of Ma'aser Sheni. Shabbos say, so the Mishnah is saying, I can't build the cost of that Ma'aser Sheni oil into the cost per participant in the Pesach, because halacha l'maisa, that would be the equivalent of redeeming Ma'aser Sheni for money in Yerushalayim. Now remember, you have the ability to redeem Ma'aser Sheni, or to transfer Ma'aser Sheni's sanctity onto money, but that's only outside of Yerushalayim. Once you get into Yerushalayim, there is no more redemption of Ma'aser Sheni. So therefore, again, I can't, essentially, if I want to use Ma'aser Sheni oil to base the Pesach, I can do that, but I must absorb that cost in its entirety and cannot pass on that cost to any of the participants. Beautiful. So we'll say now we get to a great sugya. Itmar. We'll say cham l'so cham. So we'll say, listen to this case. Look at the last Rashi in the daf. Cham l'so cham. Basar roseach l'so chala roseach. O echad shel isra ve'echad shatas. We'll say, now watch this. Let's see the following case. Let's just illustrate this in a very simple way, like Rashi does. Imagine for a moment you have meat and milk combination. Meat and milk are being mixed together. And what's the case? So let's say the meat is falling into the milk. So let's say the meat is hot and the milk is hot. So that's an easy case. Divrei hakol aser, top of ayin vav. Everybody agrees that halacha l'maisa, of course, the resulting mixture is going to be aser. Why? Because since they're both hot, there's obviously a transference of taste. Tzonin l'soch tzonin, divrei hakol muter. Say if you have meat and milk, right, the piece of meat which falls into a bowl of milk, and they're both cold, assuming you don't let it sit there for 24 hours, halacha l'maisa, everybody agrees that's what? It's muter. Right, you take out the meat, you wash it off, and you're good to go. Now we'll say, now watch this. Cham l'soch tzonin, v'tzonin l'soch cham. We'll say, what happens if the hot meat falls into cold milk, or cold meat falls into hot milk? So we'll say, so now essentially, so what happens in the case of where one of them is hot and one of them is cold? Right? What's the halacha in that situation? So we'll say, now watch this. Rav Amar Eli Gavar, Shmuel Amar Tesai Gavar. We'll say, here we go. This is a yisodistic machlok. It's very exciting. So we'll say, so Rav says, the nature, or what we'll call the temperature of the mixture, is determined by we'll call it the upper item, which is the item that falls in. Shmuel says the temperature of the mixture is defined ultimately, again, by the bottom item, the item that receives the item that falls in. Now we'll say, now what they're arguing about over here is as follows, that when you have a hot-cold mixture, do you view the mixture as hot? And therefore, again, there are blios, there's transference of taste. and therefore halacha l'maisa you really do have a halachic problem, or right, that's really what which item determines the temperature of the mixture. So Rav says the upper item, Eloi Gavar, Shmuel says Tasai Gavar, the bottom item. If you just think, well, we're not going to do Rashis, but you'll look on your own, they're very good Rashis, Eloi and Shmuel Tasai, but we'll go weiter. So Tanan, Nataf Merot Valacharis, we'll say, let's analyze this. So we'll say, so remember, you could have the same exact case. I just want to point out something amazing over here. The same exact case, a hot piece of meat falls into a cold bowl of milk. So I will say, so now listen to this. Rav will say, basar b'chalaf. It's aser. They're both aser. Eloi gavar, right? The meat was hot, then makes the mixture hot, and therefore there's transference of taste. Shmuel says, it's fine. Well, we'll see exactly what Shmuel says. But for now, Shmuel says it's fine. The bottom, right, the milk is cold. The bottom item determines the temperature of the mixture. No basar b'chalav. We'll say same exact case. One will say it's Isur D'Oraisa. One will say it's mutter. Wild. So Tanan, nataf merot for alacheres. So we'll say now. Remember, Gemara said, let's go back. Let's analyze this machlokes through the lens of the Mishnah. Remember, what did the Mishnah say? Nataf merot for alacheres. Right. Let's say some of the gravy of the Karban Pesach fell on the wall of the oven, and then remember what happened, then splashed back onto the Karban Pesach itself. So nataf merot alacheres v'chazer elov yitalas makomo. So what do you have to do? Halacha l'maisa, you have to strip away a little layer of meat from the Karban Pesach. So the Gemara says, now let's analyze this case. I will say, we're assuming now kasaga daitra becheres sonenes. Now I will say, it's interesting. The Gemara is presupposing that the cheres, right, the earthenware utensil itself is cold. So what's the case here? So let's analyze the case. You have gravy coming off the Karban Pesach, right? So the gravy drips off the Pesach onto the cold oven, right? Splashes back then from the oven back into the Pesach. Okay? So we'll say, so remember again, before we even know this, what's happening over here? What is this a case of? Hot gravy on top, cold cheres on the bottom, right? Gravy's hitting the cheres and then bouncing back ultimately to the Karban Pesach. So now watch this. So remember, the Mishnah said, this case is actually not such a big deal. What do you have to do? I'm sorry, this case is a big deal. Yitalas makomo. You have to go ahead and not just remove a little bit of a layer, but you have to remove something a bit more substantive from the Pesach. Because remember, like Rashi said in the Mishnah, gravy gets absorbed into the meat. So you have to, Rashi doesn't, the Mishnah doesn't give us an exact amount, but as opposed to yiklof, which just means a very thin outer layer, yital esmakomo clearly means you have to take out a little bit more of a chunk of the meat. Any area where the gravy could have gotten absorbed. So watch this. Bishlam Rav Damri Loi Gavar. So according to Rav, this Mishnah makes sense. Because remember, Rav says that whenever you have two items, the temperature of the mixture is determined by what? By the upper item. So this case makes perfect sense. Therefore what? Mishum hachi yitos makomo. This is why when the gravy splashes back onto the Pesach, you have to remove a little bit of the chunk of the meat. Why? Because what happens when hot gravy falls onto cold earthenware? So remember, the hot gravy heats up the earthenware, because remember Rav says, Eloi Gavar, the upper item, which determines the temperature of the mixture. Now this is where it gets wild. So remember, in Rav's view of Eloi Gavar, remember, no matter which way you hold in this, when Rav says Eloi Gavar, that means it is the top item which determines the temperature of the mixture, which means that the top item overtakes and fundamentally changes the bottom item. So watch what happens according to Rav. The hot gravy falls onto the cold earthenware. And what does the hot gravy effectively do? What does it do? It heats up the earthenware. So now the gravy is hot gravy falls onto the cold earthenware, heats up the cold earthenware, and therefore now the earthenware is viewed as heating up the gravy. Now we have a problem. Why? Because now you have Karban Pesach gravy that was heated by something other than tzli ish, other than a fire. It was heated by metal. And now what's going to happen? And now what happens? You have gravy that was heated up by metal, that now splashes back into the Karban Pesach, which means now that what? the Karban Pesach itself has effectively been at least partially cooked by something other than the open fire. A dramatic shita. V'rachmana amar, tzli eish v'lo tzli machmas davar acher. And the Torah explicitly says, Karban Pesach is only tzli eish, and not tzli as a result of anything else. Therefore, so according to Rav, the statement of the Mishnah makes sense. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, yitalas makomo. Now again, to be clear, this doesn't invalidate the Pesach, but what it just requires is for you to remove the piece of meat that absorbed the gravy. That's what it does require. Elo l'shmuel domer tesai gavar. But according to Shmuel, Bosai, you hold that it is the bottom item which ultimately goes in and determines the nature of the mixture. Cheres, kevin the tzonin, who akore maker the rotov, amai yitales makomo. I will say, according to Shmuel, who says tisai gavar, the bottom item is what determines the nature of the mixture. Then what? When hot gravy falls onto cold earthenware, what's the status? Cold, right? And therefore, essentially, the earthenware cools down the gravy, so that when the gravy actually falls, splashes back into the Pesach, there's no heating up from a cheres. So therefore, according to Shmuel, ultimately, why should you have to remove really any part of the Karban Pesach? It's cold gravy splashing back onto the Karban Pesach, which should have absolutely no impact. To which the Gemara says, "Kedam Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Shmuel b'solas rosachos hachanami v'cheres rosech." We'll see a little bit later on. It's dealing with hot flour. So we'll see what that means in just a moment. So too over here we're dealing with a hot earthenware stove. So we'll say, the Gemara says we were wrong. We were presupposing for some reason that the earthenware container was cold, and that's why it would be a support for Rav, but a Shaila on Shmuel. But in fact, the earthenware container is hot, which makes sense, because if you're talking about roasting the Karban Pesach inside of an earthenware container on top of a fire, the pashtos, the earthenware container gets hot. And therefore I will say, because it's hot, what is this a case of? What is the case of? This is a case of cham l'soch cham, of a hot item going into a hot item, which everyone agrees what? Is aser. Right? That's how the Gemara started, that's how the Itmar started out. It's cham l'socham, so it's hot gravy onto a hot earthenware container, and therefore when it splashes back onto the Karban Pesach, everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa you have to remove a chunk of the Pesach where the gravy could have gotten absorbed into. Good. So we'll say we're not finished yet. Still machlokes Rav and Shmuel. So Tnan, notaf meirotvo ala solas. So we'll say, now listen to this. If some of the gravy went ahead and got absorbed into flour, yikmots es makomo. You have to go ahead and remove that section of gravy, that section of flour. Excuse me. So we'll say, now we're assuming over here that we're once again talking about flour that's cold. So we'll say, according to Rav, who says that it is the upper item which determines the temperature of the mixture, it makes sense that you have to remove a handful of flour. Why? Because what happens? Because the hot gravy falls onto the cold flour, heats up the cold flour. The hadar hodrane, the hadra solas l'didei. And then we'll say, what happens? So we'll say, what happens over here? So remember, according to Rav, so the hot gravy falls onto the cold flour. The hot gravy heats up the cold flour. The cold flour then becomes hot. Then again, so to speak, quote unquote, cooks or heats up the gravy. And it turns out that what? You now have gravy of Karban Pesach that has been cooked by something other than tzli eish. And that's why ultimately, again, the gravy is going to be aser, but because gravy, remember, gets absorbed, you have to remove a handful of the flour. The kamatri osech machmas chamus of the solas, v'rachman amar tzli eish lo tzli machmas davar acher. So according to Rav, we'll say, you understand, by the way, how far this concept of Eloi Gavar goes. You will say it's not just the pshat, just so you see, before you saw these Gemaras, you would say, okay, Eloi Gavar means, so if I have hot meat that falls into cold milk, so therefore Allah Chalamaysa, the upper item is what determines the temperature of the mixture, and it's considered as if they're cooking together. Now, so you see, it's actually a step further. That when a hot item falls into a cold item, we view it halachically as if, according to Rav, that the hot item actually heats up the top item, heats up the bottom item, and then there's another step. And then the bottom item, so to speak, goes back to go ahead and cook the upper item, which is why that when you have Pesach gravy that falls into flour, so hot gravy that falls into flour, the hot gravy heats up the flour is heated. As a result, now the flour itself, quote unquote, cooks the gravy, and now I have Pesach gravy that was cooked by something other than tzli eish. And halacha l'maisa, that is aser. So it's an incredible chiddush how Rav is understanding this. El Shmuel, Dharma Tesai Gavar, Solas Kevan Sonenesi, Akure Kamekerle, Lamali Yikmot says Makomo. But according to Shmuel Bose, who says Tesai Gavar, says the bottom item determines the temperature. So if the flour is cold, then when the gravy falls into the flour, we'll say what really happens? The gravy is cooled off. And if the gravy is cooled off, the story's done. So again, I will say really in this case, you shouldn't have to remove anything, right? If you think about it, it's a machlokes again about what to do with with those parentheses. So we'll just, the Maram takes it out, but we'll just leave it alone for now. But the point over here is if you hold Tesai Gavar, you don't have to remove a handful of flour. You really don't. At most, maybe a klipa, maybe a thin layer, but you certainly don't have to take a kmitza. Rabbi Yomi Amar Shmuel b'solas rosachas. No, what's the case? The case of Osai is not the flour wasn't cold; the flour was hot. So therefore, I will say as we go through the cases in the Mishnah. So therefore, we've established number one that the case of the gravy falling onto the cheres is a case where the cheres is hot. The case of the gravy falling into the flour, it's a case where the flour is hot. And therefore, again, really because it's hot, this Mishnah does not get into the discussion or the machlokes of Rav and Shmuel, right? Rav and Shmuel are only dealing with a case where one item is cold and one item is hot. So how do you determine the temperature of the mixture? Rav saying Iloi Gavar, upper item, Shmuel saying Tisoi Gavar, lower item, to which the Gemara is effectively saying, our Mishnah is not wading into this machlokes. Because our Mishnah, both so far as we've established it, is what? Is a case of Cham Luso Cham. A hot item falling into a hot item. So Tinan, Sacha B'Shem Mishal Truma. So let's go keep going through the Mishnah. So what do we learn in the Mishnah? Sacha B'Shem Mishal Truma. If you basted your carbon Pesach in Truma oil, Im Chaburas Kohanim Yochelu. If you have a Chabura of Kohanim, no problem, eat it. Im Shal Yisrael. If it's a group of Yisraelim, so I will say, if I'm a Yisrael, I can't eat carbon Pesach basted in Truma oil. So what do I do? Im Chayhu Yadichenu. If the carbon is still raw, then Allah Chalamaisa just wash it off. Just wash off the oil. Im tzlihu yiklo pesachitzon. But if I roasted it already, then what? Then just go ahead and take off the thin outer layer of the Pesach. So bishlam l'Rav da'amar ilai gavar amatu lahachi sagile beklipa mishum dilai tzoninhu. So we'll say according to Rav, Rav says ilai gavar. Right? Remember again, I will say the assumption is the oil is cold. Right? When you apply the oil is cold, and therefore Allah l'maisa again. All you need to do is just take off a little klipa. However, according to Shmuel Damar Tesai Gavar, Kevan Dechamhu Mivla Bala Amai Sagile Beklipa. Nissar Legamre. Supposed to say, but according to Shmuel who says Tesai Gavar, then Halach Lamaisa, the bottom item, i.e. the Pesach is hot. So shouldn't we say that the oil is fully absorbed throughout the entire carbon Pesach, and removing a klipa should not be enough? The entire Pesach should be asa because halacha l'maisa, you have a Pesach that's absorbed truma oil. To which the Gemara is supposed to say, first white line, shiny sicha demashu ba'amahu davida. It's interesting. Apparently, when at least when the Mishnah is talking about basting, it was really a very, very, very small amount of oil, a negligible amount of liquid. So because that's a negligible amount of liquid, even Shmuel, who holds Tisai Gavar, the bottom item is the one that determines the bottom item is the one that determines the temperature, and the bottom item is hot. Here, because it's such a small, negligible amount, all you require is the removal of a klipa. Okay, Tanya Kavase Dishmor. So we'll say, so now we are still. So it turns out, we'll say, just simply put, our Mishnah has nothing to do with Machlokes Rav and Shmuel, right? That's bottom line, right? Case number one of the cheres is dealing with a case of a cheres that is hot. Case number two of the flour, the gravy that falls into the flour is hot. Case number three, ultimately again, of the carbon being basted with the oil of truma, is dealing with a very, very negligible amount of oil, where everyone will agree that halacha l'maisa all you require is a klipa. So bottom line, the halachas of our Mishnah, nothing to do with Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. So therefore, the Gemara says as follows. Let's analyze the Machlokes a little bit more, though. Tanya Kavasi Shmuel, but Brisa that supports Shmuel. Remember again, Shmuel holds Tisai Gavar. Right? To say the easy way to remember it is Rav, shorter name, right? Lighter things usually rise up to the top. So Rav Ilai Gavar, Shmuel, longer name, heavier things usually to sing to the bottom. Tisai Gavar. Easy way to remember it. So the Gemara says as follows, or you could just memorize it. Tanya Kavasi Shmuel, Cham Luso Cham Aser. If a hot item falls into a hot item, it is aser. V'chin tzonin shenasan l'socham aser. Similarly, again, I want to point out, cham l'socham, everyone agrees, right? That's not that case is not an argument case. Hot item falls into a hot item. Obviously, there's a transference of taste. What about tzonin shenasan l'socham? If a cold item falls into a hot item, Aser. Ultimately, again, it is Aser. This is Shita Shmuel. Cham l'soch tzonin. However, what happens if a hot item falls into a cold item, like a hot piece of meat falls into a cold bowl of milk, or tzonin l'soch tzonin, or for that matter, cold meat falls into cold milk, halacha l'maisa madiach. All you need to do is wipe it off. So we'll say this is Shita Shmuel. Everything is determined by the temperature of the bottom item. And therefore, again, if I have hot meat that falls into cold milk, Shmuel said, again, the two bookend cases of cham l'soch cham, tzonin l'soch tzonin, everyone agrees in those cases. Hot item falls into a hot item, aser. Cold item falls into a cold item, all you need to do is wipe off the meat, and you're good to go. So the Gemara asked an interesting question. Cham l'soch tzonin madiach. So now you told me that when a hot item falls into a cold item, all you need to do is wipe it off. So a hot piece of meat that falls into a cold bowl of milk, all you need to do is wipe off the meat. But one second. Kevan dechamhu ademaker le yafshad lo bala porta klipa mianibai. But when hot meat falls into cold milk, as much as you want to say that the bottom item determines the temperature, but as the milk cools off the meat, is there not some absorption that occurs in those few moments? Something. Should you not have to remove at least the klipa of the meat? In other words, we have to acknowledge that when something boiling hot falls into something cold, even if you want to say the bottom item will go ahead and overtake the upper item, there's still those couple of moments where the hot item is still hot. Is there not some level of absorption? In other words, we'll say, it won't make the hot item aser, but should you not at least remove a klipa's worth of the hot item? To which the Gemara says, Ela ima, cham l'soch tzonin kolef, tzonin l'soch tzonin madiach. So the Gemara says, according to Shmuel, when a hot item falls into a cold item, you'll have to remove a klipa. You will remove just a small outer strip, a small outer layer, but when cold falls into cold, all you need to do is wipe it off. Tanya idach, another brisa, basar roseach shnafal l'soch chalav roseach, hot meat that falls into hot milk, v'chin tzoni shnafal l'soch cham, or for that matter, cold meat that falls into hot milk, aser. Cham l'soch tzonin, what happens if hot meat falls into cold milk, or tzonin l'soch tzonin, or cold meat falls into cold milk, madiach. All you need to do is wipe it off. So says the Gemara again, cham l'soch tzonin madiach. So when hot meat falls into cold milk, all you need to do is wipe off the meat. Kevan dechamhu, since the meat is hot, ademakerle, as it's cooling down, i'afsha de lo bala porta, certainly it absorbs something. So the Gemara says, klipa ma'inabai, you should at least have to remove a klipa. Ela ima, cham l'soch cham, kolef, cham l'soch tzonin, kolef, tzonin l'soch tzonin madiach. Rather, again, according to Shmuel, which we'll have to say, is when a hot item falls into a cold item, you remove a klipa. But when a cold item falls into a cold item, all you need to do is go ahead and wipe it off. So we'll say, so this is incredibly important. So therefore, so what turns out is as follows. Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav says, Ilai Gavar. Upper item determines the nature of the mixture. So if the upper item is hot, it's a hot mixture, and therefore halacha l'maisa, again transference of the Shmuel says tisai gavar. It is the bottom item which determines the nature of the mixture. Now what we've seen is a very important qualification to Shita Shmuel, which is that even when a hot piece of meat falls into a cold bowl of milk, which now both say again tisai gavar, Shmuel holds the bottom item determines everything. Therefore, according to Shmuel, this is a cold mixture. It's true it's a cold mixture, but we do recognize that it takes a little bit of time for the meat to be overtaken by the cold milk, the hot meat to be overtaken by the cold milk. There is some level of absorption, and therefore, in that case, you would have to remove a klipa. So therefore, cham l'soch cham, everyone agrees aser. Tzonin l'soch tzonin, cold into cold, halacha l'maisa, again, only requires hadacha, a wiping off. Shmuel will say, cham l'soch tzonin, hot falls into cold, that will require a klipa. Good. Amar Mar, tzonin l'soch tzonin madiach. So we'll listen to this. So we said before that when, let's say, cold meat falls into cold milk, all you need to do is wipe off the meat. Amar Rav Hura lo shana ela shelo molchu. That's only if one of the items is not salted. Aval molchu, but if one of the items is salted, aser. then Abba will say ultimately the mixture becomes aser. Why? Damar Shmuel, maliach harihu kroseach. Because Rabbi will say salting is like roasting. So if one of the items in the mixture is salted, then halacha l'maisa that is the equivalent of the two items being roasted, being roasted together. Maliach kroseach. Kavashu k'mavoshel. We'll say kavashu k'mavoshel means that when a solid item sits in a liquid for more than 24 hours, that affects a cooking process. But not our topic for now. Amar Rava, hadar mishom alecho kroseach. But Rava comes along and says, by the way, when Shmuel said that a salted item is like items are roasted together, so the Gemara says, lo amar ela shelo necha machmas molcho, aval necha machmas molcho lo. That's only so if one of the items is so salted that it can't be eaten as a result of its saltiness. That's what I will say. But if an item is so salted that it cannot be consumed as a result of its saltiness, then it's as if the two items are roasted together. Hahu bar gozla, the nafalakad kamcha, was an interesting case. He had a pigeon. Is obviously talking about a dead pigeon, a shechted pigeon, right? A raw shechted pigeon that fell into a bowl of kamcha. Rashi says kamcha is kusach. Old is kusach. What's that, right? All roads lead back to kusach, right? Our favorite Babylonian dish made of curdled milk, right? Moldy bread, and I'm sure a couple of other ingredients. So I'll say, so again, but bottom line for our purposes today, it's milchiks. That's the point over here, right? So I have a raw pigeon that fell into the kusach. Sharia Rav Chinna Breidera me Pashrunya. So this is this. Rav Chinna Breidera from Pashrunya permitted the pigeon. So you can eat the pigeon. Amar Rava man chacham lemeshe milsa kiha ilav Rav Chinna Breidera me Pashrunya. So Rava said, who is as smart as Rav Chinna Breidera from Pashrunya to permit such a thing? The Gavra Rabahu. He's such a smart man. Amar lacha kemer shmal reikum malich rasech. Because what was the chiddush here? Kusach, or kamcha as they're calling it over here, is salted. It's salted. So one second. So now I have a pigeon. But Pashtus, the pigeon is, remember that the pigeon is, everything is cold, right? The kusach is cold, the pigeon is cold. So this is a case of tzonin l'soch tzonin. But the kusach is salted. So doesn't the presence of salt make it as if the items are being cooked together? No. So kiyamar shmuel malecha groseach shenecha machmas molcho. Hi necha machmas molcho. Because as Shmuel said, remember the issue of maliach groseach. When do we say that a salted item, halacha lemaisa again, is like roasting? That's only when it's so salted that it can't be eaten as a result of its saltiness. That's obviously not the case on the kusach. V'hani milichai. But this is only true if the pigeon was raw. Aval tzli by kliba. But if the pigeon was roasted and then it fell into the kusach, you would have to remove an outer layer of the pigeon. And this is only true if the flesh of the pigeon was smooth without cracks. Aval ispe pili. But if it had cracks in the skin, aser. Ultimately, again, we would assume that some of the kusach is absorbed into the cracks, and therefore the pigeon cannot be eaten. Furthermore, again, if the pigeon was seasoned, then halacha l'maisa aser, because we assume that ultimately, again, the seasoning makes the flesh even softer, and therefore it would absorb from the kusach. Incredible. Amar Rav says this as well. Say again, we don't. Well, I'm going to try to see time. This machlokes Rav and Shmuel is brought down in Yeridea in Siman Tzadik Aleph. Siman Tzadik Aleph, Sif Dalit. So if we get to it, I'm going to hope that we're going to get to it today, Meretz Hashem. But we're going to see, we actually paskin like Shmuel. Halacha l'maisa, we paskin to soy gavar. That when you have a mixture of items, it is the bottom item that ultimately, again, determines the temperature of the mixture. But yet we're going to see that we actually paskin like Shmuel with all the qualifications of the Gemara. So therefore, for example, just very quickly, if a hot piece of meat were to fall into a cold, I know I have some trouble saying, a cold bowl of milk, as much as Shmuel says to say gavar, and therefore should be treated like a cold mixture, the Shulchan Aruch paskins, yes, like Shmuel to say gavar, but the meat will require klipa. Right? You will have to remove an outer layer of meat. So again, let's get through the Gemara, then I'm to show you the halacha l'maisa. Amar Rav, so Rav says, Basar shchuta shamein, we'll say another great sugya. Basar shchuta shamein, shetzlo basar nevela kachush. If you go ahead and you roast literally shechted meat that is fatty, and you shecht it together with nevela meat, which is kachush, which is weak. So we'll say, so now what's happening over here? If you look at Rashi, Tab Rashi, Ayin Vavam, at base 76b. So we'll say the case over here is as follows. It's a great case. So we'll say, so imagine for a moment you have an oven. Now remember again, really all this oven is a big metal utensil. Inside of that big metal utensil, you have a fire burning on the ground. Right? Over the fire, you have two spits. one spit has a mamish, a zaftig, fatty, kosher animal, right? And the other one has a little nebachol nevela animal, right? Now they're cooking together. The spits are 10 feet apart. They're cooking together, however, in the same metal receptacle, over the same fire. So what's the halacha? Aser. Rav says the kosher meat will be aser. Why is that? My taima mefatmi mehadadi. So what it literally means is they fatten each other up. Now, if you go back to Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says, "Betana sheishipudim aser shareach min hashemen nichnas lekachosh umefatmo v'chozer ze umotzirech gamu v'kosh kin shchuta krusha unevesha." I will say, watch this. This is wild. Rav says the aroma, the reach, the aroma of the kosher animal enters into the nevela animal, and then as a result, kind of cooks up the nevela animal. The nevela animal then emits its reach. It goes into the kosher animal. They're exchanging reach, aroma, or scent. And Rav holds recha milsihi. Rav holds that aroma is considered to be halachically real, and therefore the animals, well, the nevela obviously is not kosher, but the kosher animal will become aser. Now, I will say, the chiddush over here is that even if it's the kosher animal that is the fatty one, we still assume that ultimately, again, mefat me mehadadi, literally means they fatten each other up. So they exchange reach, they exchange aroma, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, the kosher animal will be aser. But Levi says no. Afilu basar shchuta kalkosh shetzlo and basar nevet shamein mutter. Levi says not true. Even if the kosher animal is the nebachol one, and the nevela is the zaftig one, even in that case, the kosher animal will still be mutter. My taima recha ba'amu. Both said this is such an incredibly important sugya, right? Because Levi says it's recha ba'amu. It's just, both say now recha, we could translate it as scent, aroma, steam, right? It's recha ba'amu. It's just reach. The recha lav milsuhu. And both say aroma, steam, scent is not tangible. So because it's not tangible, therefore halacha l'maisa, it's halachically insignificant. We'll say an incredibly important halacha. We'll say, you understand, by the way, again, we're going to have to add this to halacha l'maisa, we'll say, but this is an incredibly important sugya in the realm of using the same oven for milchiks and fleishiks, right? This is the sugya. I mean, here it's kasher and treif, but it's the same sugya. So here we go. Avid Levi uvda bereish galusa. This is wild. Big diva davar acher. So Levi went according to his reasoning, and Abos in the house of the Reish Galusa, in one tanor, they were roasting on one spit a kosher animal, and on one spit davar acher, a pig, right? A chazer. Now we'll say, why they were roasting a chazer in the house of the Reish Galusa is not immediately clear. The simple answer could be the Reish Galusa employed many Gentiles as well. So maybe they were just non-Jewish individuals going ahead and, whatever it was. He'll say, but can you imagine this today? Right? Can you imagine, right? Mamish, they would run this guy to town, Levi. Right? So Levi was allowing the roasting of a kosher animal next to a chazer in the same metal receptacle in the house of the Reish Galusa. Because you're going to say, because Levi said, what's happening? Tell me what's happening over here. Remember, two spits, 10 feet apart, 20 feet apart, 30, it doesn't matter. 5 feet apart, doesn't make a difference. The most that's happening over here is transference of reicha, of reach. And reach is lav milsihi. Meisver is a kasha, ain't tol mishnei pesachim ke'echam, mipnei hataroves. Boss, it's interesting. You can't shech two carbon pesachs together because of an issue of taroves, because of forbidden mixtures. So therefore, again, we'll say, the Gemara says, my love taroves tamim. So we'll say, what does this mean? A taroves of what? So we'll say, the Gemara says, is it not that we're concerned about taroves of flavor? So we'll say, so imagine this for just a moment. Now remember, it's interesting. I don't know enough of Karban Pesach history. Jeremy, you're gonna WhatsApp your sister about this one also. Hey, so Karban Pesach history. So I don't know how. I always imagine that they were always roasting it on open fires. It could very well be that they maybe use these metal containers, which obviously allows the animal to cook faster, which is interesting, right? This tanur, which apparently is permitted. So halacha l'maisa. If you have two chaburas who are roasting their Karban Pesach inside of the same metal utensil. So the Gemara says you're not allowed to cook two Karban Pesach, you're not allowed to roast two Karban Pesachs together because of a fear of taroves. I will say now taroves means what? Mixture. Ma'alav taroves tamim v'kashir levi. Doesn't that mean taroves a flavor? A flavor. What kind of taroves you worried about over here? That worried about the aroma of Karban Pesach. A is going to get into Karban Pesach. B, and vice versa. To which the Gemara says, "Lo nitnei taroves gufin." No. We'll say it's not taroves of flavors. What are we concerned about? That you may come to mix up the karbanos. Right? Because remember, I will say, I would assume that lambs on a spit pretty much look the same. So therefore, I will say, Salach Alamaisa, if Chabura Aleph and Chabura Beis are both roasting their Pesach together, it's easy to imagine, especially after a couple of cups of wine, right, which is part of the night of the Seder, that you forget which Pesach was yours. So therefore, we don't want two Chaburas going in and roasting their Pesachim together. Nothing to do with aroma, actually mixing up the bodies of the carcasses. How can I understand when the Tani say, What's this make sense? Because what does it say later on? Even if one Chabura is using a Gedi is a goat, and one Chabura is using a lamb. So if you say we're concerned about mixing up the actual animals, it makes sense. Even meaning, the Gemara is saying, even if they're using two different animals, apparently a shechted goat and a shechted lamb look different. So even if you're going to say they're using two different animals, therefore again, they could tell there's a concern. But if you say the concern ultimately is one of transference of aroma, then I will say it makes no difference if one is a lamb, one is a sheep, or both are sheep, or both are sheep, or both are goats. Elamai al karachach mibnei ta'aroves gufin hu da'aser. Aval ta'aroves shari, aval ta'aroves tamim shari. Rather, you see, I will say that when the Bryce is concerned and doesn't want two chaburas roasting their karbanos together, that's why we're concerned that they may mix up the actual karbanos. But we're not concerned about what? A transfer of aroma, one from the other. Why? Because apparently what we're saying is, it's recha ba'alma, it's only aroma. The recha lav milsa, and aroma, scent, steam. I should really take steam out of this, because steam is zeya, and zeya is really a little bit something. We'll call it just aroma and scent. Really is halachically meaningless. So the Gemara says, Rav. So should this not be a refutation of the position of Rav, right? This clearly shows that we're not concerned about the transference of aroma or scent. This should refute the position of Rav. To which the Gemara says, what's the case? The case of is where you're roasting the two Pesachs in two different kederos. I must say keder literally means a pot. What are you talking about, two different pots? You're not allowed to roast a Karban Pesach in a pot at all. So what are you talking about? To which the Gemara says, rather, what it means is that halacha l'maisa, you're roasting them it's like they're in two different kederas. Rashi points out, shipud mikan v'tel gadol shel gechalim o afra be'emtza. This is very interesting. It's true, you may be roasting them in one metal receptacle, but the spits are separated by a pile of rocks in between them, right? Or I should say, a pile of coals or a pile of rocks. The point over here could very well be, in this case, there's no possibility for transference of aroma. This is what it means to say. You're not allowed to shech two Karban Pesachs together out of a concern that they may get mixed up. My taroves, what does it mean, a mixture? First wide line, taroves tamim. It means, again, a mixture of taste. Levi, this is Levi's interpretation. That we are concerned over here about reach, a transference of aroma, not taste, of aroma. And even in a case where, let's say, you built a pile of coals in between the two karbanos, so there's no concern of transference of reach. Nevertheless, it's still going to be aser mishum taroves gufin, because of a concern, ultimately, again, that you may actually come to mix up the karbanos themselves. And even if halacha l'maisa, one is a goat and one is a lamb, there is still a concern of a mix-up. So I will say, so according to Levi, there really will be, according to Rav, I should say, there really will be halacha l'maisa, two concerns over here, one of reach and one of mixing up the karbanos. According to Shmuel, only a concern. I'm sorry, just the opposite. According to Levi, only one concern of mixing up the karbanos. According to Rav, two concerns of both mixing up the karbanos as well as a concern of transference of reach. So we'll say, so now remember, two major machlokim so far on this blot. Machlokis number one, Eloi Gavar, Tisai Gavar, Machlokis Rav and Shmuel. I'll tell you right now, halakha l'maisa we paskin like Shmuel, Tisai Gavar. Now what about in this second discussion, Reach Milsa, Recha Milsi, Recha Lav Milsi, Levi saying Recha Lav Milsi, Rav saying Recha Milsi. We'll see that halakha l'maisa we essentially are paskin like Levi of Recha Lav Milsei, but it's going to be a qualified Levi. Just like it was a qualified Shmuel of Tisai Gavar, it's going to be a qualified Levi as well. Let's go a little bit weiter. Amar Amari. We'll say quickly. So Amari says, Kitanoi, this machlokes of Recha Milsei is a machlokes Tanoim. We'll say, this is such a great case. Harode Pascham Avenas Nabi Chavis Yain Shal Truma. We'll say, what happens if you take hot bread? Watch this. You take hot bread and you put it on top of a barrel of truma wine. This is a great case. Hot bread on top of truma wine. Now, both say, now remember again, this is my bread. I'm a Yisrael. I can't eat truma. So I put hot bread on top of truma wine. Get ready for this. Rabbi Meir says, Aser. Aser. Rabbi Huda Matir. And Rabbi Huda says that it's mutter. So both say, Pashtas, what's happening over here? Well, let's see. Rabbi Yossi Matir B'Shal Chitin, V'osa B'Shal Sa'orim, B'Mvei Shesorim Shabos. Rabbi Yossi says, it is mutter if it was a loaf of wheat bread, Aser if it was a loaf of barley bread because barley absorbs. So we'll say, so obviously what's happening, or what's the machlokes? The machlokes is, does the bread absorb the vapors of the wine? Right? A wine emits aroma, it emits reach. Does the bread absorb the aroma? If the bread absorbs the aroma, then I, the Yisrael, now again, it's two questions. Number one, does bread absorb aroma? And then question number two is what? Is the absorption of truma aroma problematic or not? My laf tanaihi, is this not a machlokes? Demar savar recha lav milsihi. One opinion holds that halacha lamaisa recha is insignificant, and therefore the bread is going to be totally permitted. Umar savar recha milsihi. And one opinion holds that vapor, or aroma is significant, and therefore the bread is viewed as having absorbed truma, and halacha lamaisa is going to be aser. To which the Gemara says, Levi, Vadai Tanahi. According to Levi, ultimately, again, it is definitely a machlokes Tanaim. So also remember again, Levi needs it to be a machlokes Tanaim, right? Because it will say otherwise. Again, the previous brises contradict Levi. So according to Levi, it's only going to be a machlokes Tanaim. The Rav Neima Tanahi. So according to Rav should also say that this is a machlokes Tanaim. Amar Lecha Rav will say like this: the Kuli Alma Recha Milsi. According to Rav, will say everyone agrees that halacha lemaisa. That halacha lemaisa recha milsihi, that reach is significant. So the Gemara says, lav itmar Allah, that he amar barachana amar Reish Lakish bepaschama v'chavis psucha divreka. Suppose in our qualification brisa, everyone agrees in the following case: if the bread is hot and the barrel is open, everyone will agree that the bread is aser, because again, everyone will agree that in that case, open barrel, hot bread, the bread definitely absorbs from the wine. Again, when we say absorbs, the reach of the wine. Similarly, if the bread is cold and the barrel is closed, everyone agrees no absorption occurs over here. Both say, what's the machlokes case? Hot bread, closed barrel. Or pas sonanas v'chavis psucha, cold bread, open barrel. So the Gemara says, we'll say v'hanami, and this case over here, of the two Pesachim, right, two Korban Pesachs roasting in one oven together, is like a case of kipas chama v'chavis psucha damu. It'll be like a case of hot bread and an open barrel. So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, the Gemara wants to suggest that this discussion of Recha Milsa is in fact a machlokes tanoim. Is Recha significant or not? And I just want to point out that remember, this case is not a totally fair case. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, you're dealing with truma. And it is possible that truma may be treated differently than anything else. So we'll say, let's go, we have another minute. Actually, we don't have another minute. We'll stop over here. We'll pick up with this. Let's quickly. Tani, we'll stop. We'll stop over here. We'll pick up, because again, this case actually happens to be a great case as well. We'll stop over, we'll pick up in Miraz Hashem at this period tomorrow. We'll see Yeshakayach.
I want you to worry, we took care of everything that was on.